Well, hi everyone. Welcome to the Journal of Law Reform's second panel of our symposium. We're really excited to have you all with us and to have our speakers here to run this panel. And I will kick it off to our moderator, Professor Lefort.
Thank you, Amy. Yes, welcome everyone. Today's panel is about how fines and fees target racial minorities. And we have an amazing group of panelists here today. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. Michael Dougherty is currently an in-house counsel for the Navajo Nation, and he's formerly a public defender for the Hopi tribe. He's also worked in rural legal service as an attorney for the DNA People's Legal Service. Professor Alexis Harris is a professor of sociology at the University of Washington. Her research is fundamentally centered on issues of inequality, poverty, and race in the United States justice system. Erin Keith is a staff attorney at the Detroit Justice Center. She focuses on criminal legal system reform through a racial equality lens by providing direct representation to indigent and formerly incarcerated clients. And finally, Dr. Meghan O'Neill is a research investigator at the Institute for Social Research at Michigan and an empirical legal studies research scholar at Michigan Law. She studies vulnerable populations in America, particularly focused on racial and economic inequality, and conducts evidence-based research to make for better public policy. The way we're going to structure this panel is we're going to start with offering one question where each panelist is going to provide a short introductory 5-minute answer, and then we will have follow-up questions. So let's start. Our first question is, how is the imposition of fines and fees experienced differently for racial minorities? And where have you seen these disparities in your work? I'd like to start with Professor Harris for this question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate on this panel. I really appreciate it. And I'll start by saying that I think that if you're poor in the United States and you're sentenced to fines and fees, or what I call the system of monetary sanctions, you feel it the same way across your racial and ethnic group. But I think in terms of racism in this country, disproportionately people of color, namely African Americans, Native Americans, and Latinx people are disproportionately sentenced to fines and fees at a greater rate. So we can just sort of, as a good professor, I talk a little bit about the statistics, the context of mass incarceration and conviction in the United States. Since about 1974, we've had a 500% expansion of the numbers of people who are living behind bars in this country. So that's about 2.2 million people. And in addition, 4.6 million people are under some form of criminal supervision. So that's about 7 million people, either in cages or on supervision under constant surveillance by the police system and the criminal legal system. And this happens disproportionately by race. So 1 out of 91 white men aged 30 to 34 is in prison, 1 out of 42 Latino, and 1 out of 17 Black men is in prison. And the rates are similar for disproportionality for women of color as well. Sarah Shannon and her colleagues estimate that 3% of the adult population has been to prison, but 15%. So 15% of African American men have been estimated to have gone to prison. 8% of the adult population has a felony, but 33% of African American men have a felony in this country. That's 1 out of every 3 men. So if we think about the broad range of our criminal legal system and how the system of monetary sanctions is embedded in every crack and crevice of the processing through the criminal legal system, people of color disproportionately experience this debt burden. And I'll just highlight two pieces of research really quickly in my 5 minutes. In a study with Frank Edwards on Seattle Municipal Court here in Seattle, Washington, we found that for each class of municipal court case that we analyzed for data from 2000 to 2017, Black men and women are significantly more likely than their peers to be sentenced to incarceration through a Washington Superior Court case. Okay, so how does that happen, right? You get a traffic citation in Seattle Muni, and if you're Black, a man or woman, and you even paid or unpaid, we look down the line and you have a significantly higher likelihood of receiving some form of sentence in a Washington State Superior Court. In a similar way, people of color have a higher likelihood than white people to be charged with a DWLS-3, a driving with a license suspended in the 3rd degree, following a Seattle Municipal Court LFO, legal financial obligation sentence. And this is especially pronounced for Black drivers. What does that mean? It means that essentially traffic, the ways in which people are surveilled in their communities by police, traffic citations are a gateway drug to more severe punishment in the criminal legal system, particularly for Black drivers. One other piece of research that I'm doing with my colleagues is looking at not just the individual effects of carrying a fine or fee sentence and the debt, but how does that matter for communities? And so we have a project that looks at what we call Debtors Blocks, looking at neighborhoods that disproportionately carry this debt burden. And we found that we can observe, right, particularly looking at non-white communities in Washington State, these communities that carry a higher debt burden. And statistically significant findings are that in the future poverty rates are higher in these communities because of this state intervention. So I'll stop there, but we can clearly map out and show that people of color carry individual debt more, and it leads to more severe consequences for them in the criminal legal system. And our communities are shouldering this debt at a disproportionate rate, and it's increasing our poverty rates.
Thank you so much, Professor Harris. Erin, I'd like you to go next if you wouldn't mind.
Absolutely. So I'll echo a lot of what Professor Harris just shared in terms of my work and what we do at the Detroit Justice Center. So we represent people who are returning citizens and those who have otherwise interacted with the justice system who are poor, and especially when it comes to traffic court. So I'll talk a little bit about the different types of fines and fees we see in our work, but then I'll expound a bit more on traffic debt specifically. So typically, one way we see a lot of racial impact in terms of the types of charges being brought in fines and fees has to do with minor misdemeanors. So things like, especially in the Metro Detroit area, entering a vacant building without authorization, right? When you think of who's going to be charged with that, where are the blighted buildings? They're going to typically be in your urban municipalities. You're not going to see white people charged with that type of offense, period. And they're also less likely to be given actual jail time for that type of offense, even if they are charged with it. Another thing that we see a lot is felony non-support. So we work a lot with returning citizens who are coming out, and unfortunately, because of how our laws are in Michigan, there's no retroactive modification of support. So if you went into prison and because things aren't automated, the Secretary of State and different entities aren't notified that you owe a support obligation and that you are now incarcerated, so that obligation ends, you are accruing arrears over that period of time. And so when you're coming out, you're owing, I've had clients owing $93,000, crazy amounts of money that we then help them navigate to get that money forgiven. And if we're not able to help them, for individuals who don't have access to our services, felony non-support is an offense they can be charged with, where they're fined, thousands of dollars in addition to the actual felony. And there's no necessary, ability to assert that they were incarcerated. There's no consideration of whether that non-payment is willful. It's sheerly the amount of money and whether that person has paid it. And then lastly, we offered a report called Highway Robbery at the Detroit Justice Center. And one of the things we looked at is something we like to call the traffic debt to incarceration pipeline. So how does this occur really? When you look at police, they routinely stop Black drivers for little or no reason. So failing to stop at a stop sign, a person did a rolling stop, impeding traffic when dropping off kids at school, randomly running a person's plate and then seeing that they don't have insurance or they have expired plates, because you don't need a warrant to do that. And what happens is that amount of money then just triples and gets out of control. So from a single traffic stop, a person could have hundreds of dollars in fines and fees from a single stop, because multiple infractions can be charged from that stop. And so a lot of the times we're seeing things like an impound fee at $700, a bond set at $500, the fine and or jail at $350, a license reinstatement fee at $125. And again, this is just from one stop. And so if you're in a community that is over policed, you're naturally going to see the fines and fees affect these individuals in ways that are just overly punitive, excessively punitive. And then the last thing I'd like to highlight is fines and fees tend to be more stigmatizing for people of color and more life altering. When I've noticed in representing clients, when you're white and poor, it's acceptable that you fell on hard times. But when you're Black and you're poor, I hear a lot of lazy bootstrap rhetoric from judges. They don't believe hardship, even if there's documentation. There's a questioning of how one's choices led to their poverty, despite the fact that a person might have documented evidence of an eviction or unconstitutional tax foreclosure, or they're on public benefits, or all these other things that would show a documented pattern of hardship. And one of the last things I wanted to highlight is a specific example of this. So I had a client who, again, we had documentation as to her homelessness. It all started because of a ticket she got for a busted taillight that she couldn't afford to fix. That led to her license being suspended. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, lost her job, had to commute to the suburbs for treatment. There was no public transit option available except transferring on 4 buses, which is impossible. If you have chemo, you're weak after your treatment. So she was driving to and from appointments and ended up getting multiple infractions over the course of her treatment period. When we, brought her to court, again, documented homelessness, she was living with her mother at that point because she had lost her home while raising her kids. And the judge literally says, "You don't look homeless to me," because she didn't appear disheveled. And she literally, on the record after that, she was, of course, shaking, and it was very traumatizing for her. And like, she broke down in tears after court. Like, how am I supposed to look homeless? Like, what does that mean? I did have a home at one point. I do own clothes. Like, I don't understand, so it can be very traumatizing as well. And I think when we have these very heightened discussions about fines and fees, sometimes we even forget about the trauma of even having the fines themselves. So
thank you for that. That's a really great point. Dr. O'Neill, I'd like to extend the invitation to you.
Thank you. Excellent comments so far. I'm happy to be here today. I would like to discuss very briefly some of my professional experience with fines and fees in the justice system. I am a research scholar at Michigan Law under the Community Corrections Fines and Fees Study, which is supported by a grant from Arnold Ventures. And what we're doing with that study is going out in 7 states and collecting information as to put together figures for what people are paying when they're under supervision. And so, as Erin said, we have so many folks under supervision in America, and the fines and fees are somewhat spiraling out of control. But what we're finding is that we don't really know how much people pay collectively as a nation. We just don't. There is not a cumulative data warehouse where this information is compiled together. And in fact, Professor Harris wrote like a seminal book about court fines and fees that everyone should read. If you haven't already bought it, go to Amazon today. But so we don't know how much people pay. And what we do know is, as scholars of the criminal justice system and sociology and law, we do know that people are being charged more than they can afford. So we are disproportionately under a structural system based in segregation, institutional racism, and disparate treatment of people of color and individuals without the means to pay. We are seeing issues with the justice system that are ramifications of the broader structural racism that we see in housing. And Erin had an excellent point. You don't look like you're homeless. Okay, so structural racism in the housing system, in the justice system, in employment, so that when individuals are charged fines and fees, when they are caught up in the legal system, which we know disproportionately is pulling in people of color, we're finding that the impact of the fine or fee as a criminal penalty is somewhat negated if the cost of collection, the collection cost of trying to get these fines and fees and charges that the individual can simply never pay. And again, Erin had an excellent empirical example about a client who owed over $90,000, and that individual is just coming out of incarceration and now has this debt that he or she owes and probably can never pay that. And so I put together a couple of slides that I'll just touch on really quickly to give you an example from my research as to how disproportionately these costs impact people of color. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if I can quickly. Everybody see it? Okay, thank you. So again, this is the Community Corrections Fines and Fees Study. We have scholars throughout the United States in 7 states going out doing field work pre-COVID in probation offices to collect records and go through kind of with a microscope paper records often to find out how much individuals are paying. And so I selected a site here in Michigan where there's a higher than average poverty rate and there's significant racial ethnic diversity. And so this is Ypsilanti Township, very close to University of Michigan. And you have about half the folks are white, half the folks are minority who live there, but you see in terms of the folks who are on probation, you have a disproportionate number of people of color. So there's an overrepresentation in that city, which is in line with what we see in America more broadly. And so in terms of the fines and fees that are being collected from the individuals on probation, these numbers are kind of astounding. So the Ypsilanti Township Probation Office is collecting over $281,586 from individuals on probation. This is a 1-year sample of individuals on probation. We have everyone who is on probation there. And so this sample is limited to people who are white and people who are Black, because there were individuals who were taken out because the sample size was not large enough or their race was not known. And so we see that this disproportionately impacts Black folks. So we have 56% of the probationer fines and fees coming in from the Black community in Ypsilanti, even though the Black community is less than half of the individuals who reside in that community. And so one thing that really hits me is, okay, so we have this overrepresentation, we have this multiple layers of institutional racism where you have disproportionate calls in to the police of people of color who are presumed to be doing something that may or may not actually be a crime. So we see that with the Karens of the world this year. There are a lot of Karen memes coming out. And so we know that there are multiple layers of institutional discrimination where people are being pulled into the system. And then once they're in the system, one thing that really gets me is, okay, so Ypsilanti is a community with a disproportionate number also of lower income white folks. So why are the individuals of color receiving higher fines and fees? And one thing I look at here is this public defender use. And so people of color being pushed into public defenders because of their likelihood of being even more poor than the poor white folks. And so we end up seeing that with the public defenders that they're potentially not as efficient at getting these fines and fees reduced, getting these fines and fees fought, getting these fines and fees dropped. And the number of clients that the defenders have is a whole nother lecture, and I'm probably about to be out of time. So I'll leave it there, that we have multiple layers of racial and economic inequality that is transpiring into a real vicious cycle of individuals being overly prosecuted, overly policed, and then fines and fees coming together to just put that sort of extra weight in people's backpack. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Michael, I'd like to turn that question to you.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that everyone else has said. I'll just talk a little about some specific things that apply in tribal court. So, I think just by falling under the jurisdiction of a tribal court, makes these Native Americans more likely to face these fines and fees. Some things that a lot of people don't know about tribal courts is they can only prosecute Indians, but they can prosecute any Indian. So I worked in the Hopi tribe. So if a Navajo person or someone who's enrolled in any tribe around the country was driving through Hopi and, had beer in their car, for example, they could be arrested and they could be, imposed with this cash bail that they can't afford, and they could be stuck on Hopi for months. If a non-native person's driving through Hopi with that beer, the tribal court can't do anything. They can call the federal agents who can come, and they're not going to do anything about, beer in the car. So that's one way that these guys just face, more likely to be picked up by police, more likely to have these bails that they can't pay. There's also a lot of different laws in tribal court that are sort of ancient laws that have stuck through for tribal courts that aren't really in state courts anymore, like how alcohol is illegal, for example. So that just makes you even more likely to get in trouble. If you're driving on the res for 4th of July with some beers, you might get locked up. You might not be able to pay your cash bail. You might be stuck in jail for 3 months. Family service is going to take your children. And that's all something that, if me in Colorado, I'm not going to get arrested for that beer. So that's just another example. It's also really tough because a lot of the people who run these tribal courts, even like me, the public defender, are from outside communities. So they bring in their impressions about cash bail. Like I had a judge who thought $1,000 was a low bail. My clients have zero income. They have absolutely no money. They live in multi-generational households. They live with their grandmas. There's no money coming in. They're never going to pay that $1,000 bail. So it's just, the judges often have an idea from courts that they've worked in the past about what, is reasonable bail, and it's not reasonable on the res. Something that Erin mentioned that in her communities she sees a lot is something that I also see, the over-policing. Like Hopi, the tribe that I worked in, passed the Tribal Law and Order Act. It's pronounced, like people call it TLOA. It was a really good law, intentions. It was to help out with like a lack of enforcement of laws in reservation communities. A lot of people hear about that, like a lot of domestic violence goes, you can call the police, they never show up. So the federal government passed this law, TLOA, that Hopi enacted. It brought in tons and tons of federal funds for more policing, which has had these unforeseen consequences that I've seen in court, where there's just police everywhere. They'll pick you up on anything. You get that cash bail you can't pay, life ruined. So that's just another example. And then finally, in my court, if you didn't pay a fine or fee, it was considered a violation of probation. So you violated your probation, they're going to put you back in jail, even if you were out on OR, your own recognizance. And, like I just can't stress enough the circumstances and poverty in these reservation communities. Like there is no money that these people have. So oftentimes like a grandmother will pay the bail for you. You're out, but then you can't pay a fine. And so it's a violation of probation. And so they take that bail money and it's lost. And that is really important money that grandmother needed. And, I don't even know where it goes because it doesn't go to our court. I think it just goes into a black hole somewhere. But that family needed that money. So I think that pretty much covers some of the specific things that I see in tribal courts that really make it tough. And, just going back to what Professor Harris was talking about, it really is just all the circumstances. Like these people are impoverished and they're facing struggles, and these fines and fees just make those circumstances so much worse. So yeah, I'll turn it back over to you guys.
Thank you, Michael. Now, I'd like to ask about how, we've talked a little bit about obviously sort of over-policing and introduced sort of the idea of how over-policing perpetuates the imposition of fines and fees on colors of community. I'd also like to talk about or ask about what other sort of legal structures in the system are continuing to help perpetuate this cycle. And Erin, I'd like to start with you, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. So to highlight over policing, one thing that really stands out to me is, of course, the statistics for some of our neighboring counties outside of Wayne County, where Detroit is located. So in Oakland County, in every single district court jurisdiction, police arrest non-white people at disproportionately high rates. For example, in the city of Ferndale, 55% of people arrested are non-white compared to making up only 23% of the population. In Royal Oak, 37% of the people arrested are non-white compared to making up only 8% of the population. And when Black and brown people are already navigating a plethora of other manifestations of systemic racism, fines and fees basically just add tax to the already burdensome criminalization of being poor. So it's kind of the perfect storm of poverty, being a person of color, and police presence, and how all of those things combine to create just a cycle that people can't get out of. I gave the one example of a client, but I think looking at it more abstractly is also helpful. So poverty leads a person to have a tail light they can't get fixed or a brake light they can't get fixed. Racialized over policing is how they're then stopped multiple times within a span of weeks for that same tail light, like multiple times. I've had clients, I'm literally looking at their driving record. I'm like, I understand that you were driving with this broken tail light. I get it. But why were you stopped 8 times in 2 months? That's because you were driving while Black and the person was looking, the officer was looking for a reason to pull you over, right? Normal people who just have a tail light, who are driving, minding their business, are not likely going to get pulled over and cited for given an actual civil infraction, given an offense for that type of thing. It's like, oh, just go take care of it. Go, here's a warning. Oh, did you know your tail light was out? But in certain communities, especially those that are cash strapped, that they need that revenue, right? So those individuals are going to be fine. That leads to other reasons that a person has to drive in the first place. So you talk about other systems. Systemic racism in and of itself causes a lot of these things. So if you live in a community where there are food deserts and there's disparate healthcare options and employment options are all in the suburbs or all in an area that you have to drive to get to, it's going to be really difficult for you not to drive. So specifically in this area, the best grocery stores are on the other side of 8 Mile Road. Your health clinics, even for things like a drive-through COVID test. I had to explain to legislators we were talking to about how having a suspended license makes battling COVID that much harder. You can't drive to go get tested. You're also, after you get your results, you're on a city bus knowing you have COVID because you have no other way to get to the store to get yourself some chicken soup, like basic things that aren't thought through. And then continuing that same scenario, I would just say racialized over policing is how a person is stopped over and over again in that suburban community and cited for the misdemeanor driving while license suspended, where they face the fines they can't pay, which then potentially lead to jail time, and then not showing up in that suburban court because you can't get back out there because you live in the city. You can't drive out there. That's not allowed. That is how you end up having a warrant. And if you have a warrant, of course, you can be arrested, you can lose your job, you can lose your kids, you can lose your home, all of these collateral consequences, all stemming from a taillight. And so I think when we look at the systems at large, it's just that they don't talk to each other and that systemic racism is prevalent through all of them. And so I think we have to address that in order to actually see results for our clients and fix some of these challenges.
Thank you. Professor Harris, I'd also like to get your input on that. And also one point that Erin raised that I thought might be interesting to explore is sort of the cash-strapped nature of these communities and sort of the, how much that they use sort of these fines and fees to fund, and it kind of helps perpetuate that. Do you mind sort of bringing that in a little bit as well with your answer?
Definitely. It's hard to go after Erin because, she's definitely, has these, I was going to say amazing, that's not the right word, but these sort of very detailed, descriptive examples that really hit home on how horrible this system really is. And I think what I can do is sort of step back and identify a couple buckets. What I like to do is, if you've heard me talk before, I talk about buckets a lot. But one bucket is this disproportionality, right? This massive, and that's the structural racism that allows police to surveil, arrest, allows prosecutors to over prosecute at more severe charges, allows judges to convict in plea bargaining. I mean, this whole system of disproportionality that gets to this very truncated data set of people who are being processed within our criminal legal system that are disproportionately Black, Native American, and Latino, and poor. So that's one thing, is this disproportionality linked to structural racism in our criminal legal system. I think that the second thing is what both Meghan and Erin have talked about, are these decision-making processes where we we give discretion to some are elected officials and some are, these street level bureaucrats that get to decide the fate of individuals in assessment of ability to pay, in assessment of willfulness, in assessment if someone looks poor or not. So that's the racism there that's embedded in the authority that these people get to make assessments on who is deserving versus who is not deserving in society. So that's another layer of racism that gets at people. And the third is, everyone's talked about this, just the cumulative disadvantage that people experience if you're a person of color in this country, from healthcare, as Erin addressed, from educational systems, the criminal legal systems, employment and housing segregation. So these are like sort of the three buckets that get us to where we're at right now and clearly highlight the unfair nature of the system of monetary sanctions. That it's just, it shows how much our criminal legal system is a two-tiered system, right? One for wealthy and one for poor. Now, when we start talking about revenue generation, that's a whole nother, this is a weird punishment, right? One punishment is to hold people accountable. One is to punish them, and one is to generate revenue for local and state jurisdictions. And so it creates this perverse incentive for police to go out and do these ticky-tack, tail light, mirror, where the mirror is, or if you have a mirror or not. So it's this perverse incentive for the state to generate money from individuals and allows them to surveil them, but also to put a warrant on them and control their bodies. And we don't know much yet. I mean, there's a couple different research articles that are trying to get at how much is being generated, how much is outstanding, is it worth it, is it not? Yale Law School, the Lyman Center, is starting, I think the first one is in February, series of workshops, monthly workshops, that's trying to bring experts together who get the financing of local governments. So if you follow the Lyman Center, you follow me on Twitter, I'll push out when it's happening. But it'll be a really interesting seminar for us to learn more about where's the money going. So I'll say that. But one other thing I'll say is that we really need to pay attention to these third-party private entities that are allowed to profit off of bodies that are incarcerated. So it's not just this issue about private federal prisons, but it's about in every jurisdiction, from probation officers to sheriff's offices and jails to jails and prisons, where we have JPay or we have these other entities that come in and they can make profit off of a literal captive audience. So I'll leave that there. Maybe we can talk about it a little bit more, but when we talk about revenue, we need to talk about people getting wealthy off of the controlling of bodies.
And I think that's a really great point, because if you were thinking about revenue generation in isolation, right, the population you would think would be the best to target for revenue generation are the ones who are easiest to get the money off of, but you're not getting that, right? You are essentially potentially, expending more money to try to recoup that money, but at the same time, that money is going to line people's pockets, right? And in this generation, because when people can't pay, then there's all these other collateral consequences that go along with that are then being that are essentially ensuring other people are profiting off of that.
Yeah, I mean, and if I could add, there's an interesting case in Washington State right now, Stephen Long, and I'll thank Bill Maurer for bringing this case I see him on the call, and Lisa Foster for bringing the case to my attention, but it's challenging excessive fines and fees. But what I'll say is that he was a man who had an apartment, had employment, lost his apartment, was living in his truck, and his truck was then towed, and he faced towing expenses. And it highlights, I had an interesting conversation with someone about this case yesterday, was that it really highlights how now our local authorities are giving power to a towing truck company, right? They represent the city of Seattle now and have that authority to try and get the money from this homeless man so that he can get essentially his house back. So it's not just even the local authorities that are using fines and fees to control bodies, but it's these local and third-party entities that can get revenue and control people.
Thank you. Dr. O'Neill, I'd like to also put sort of this to you, any of your work that you've worked on recently, to sort of give some more insight to what this looks like on the ground.
Sure, thank you. One thing that comes to mind regarding the fines and fees and the disproportionality towards people of color is going back to the slide where you see more people of color are utilizing public defenders. Okay, so one of the primary misdemeanors we're seeing being overseen in criminal courts here in Michigan has to do with drugs or alcohol. And so the actual incident itself may be, for example, a domestic, but the primary underlying issue at large tends to be someone has a substance use disorder. And this has come up in my other research that's funded by the National Science Foundation, looking at drug and alcohol abuse in Michigan and trying to use technology to improve how people roll through the system once they've obtained sobriety. And so one thing that came forth in interviews with judges in our local criminal courts is that 4 out of 5 defendants in Michigan, in their empirical experience, has a substance use issue. 4 out of 5, so that's 80%. And so you think about now we're pulling people into the criminal justice system, disproportionately people of color. There is not a disproportionate use of drugs and alcohol that should explain why for instance, drug testing fees are higher for people of color than for people who are white. And I've seen this earlier in my work with the Manhattan Narcotics Division. We're seeing a differential use of the criminal justice system such that when you have a public defender, your public defender may have 200 or more clients, okay? I've seen this in the specific instance in Ypsilanti where I was just showing those slides. If your lawyer has 200 clients and you have a defendant who's on the docket with you with a privately paid criminal attorney who maybe has a handful of clients, you are going to have a disparate outcome. So the individual who's able to access private legal counsel is probably, if they even end up on probation, if they're not able to beat the case, they're probably going to end up with fewer fees and fines because that private attorney has more time to fight and fight and fight. And when the public defender is coming in with his or her 200 clients, he's saying, plea, because he wants to help the other 199 clients so that he can try to move the cases along, because that is her or his job. And so what I'm seeing is you just have a completely disparate use of the way the justice system proliferates and continues these sort of systemically racist practices for the individuals who are coming through with drug and alcohol charges. Particularly, it's mind-boggling to me that individuals who have a drug issue are being charged more or higher fees if they are people of color than if they're white. And so much of it just happens to do with the way that their case plead out. So if the white individual was able to plea it out with a private attorney, with private counsel, and get it to an infraction that's not a misdemeanor, maybe they were able to pay a fine and now they have no probation. So their costs are done. But for the individual who had the public defender, who's disproportionately more likely a person of color, they have now 2 years or more of probation, fines and costs, and drug testing and alcohol testing and everything that comes along with that. So I'll leave that there. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, I was wondering, as a prior public defender yourself, if you wanted to sort of chime in on that, if you notice that in your work and how that exists, with you.
Yeah, totally. That what you were talking about, Dr. O'Neill, about the plea agreements is, something I saw every single day. My clients beg me for plea agreements because they're stuck in jail until they get that plea agreement. And, it's almost always drug and alcohol crimes, like you were saying. So it's not really something that you're going to have this complicated trial about and probably win. Like they had the beer in their car. They're stuck in jail. They can't pay their bails. It's like, please let me plead guilty to the crime I'm charged with so I can get out of here. And it's just so unfair. If you pay that bail, obviously you can have a lot more strategy involved. You can file a bunch of motions. You can wait on the prosecutor to respond to those motions. But if you're stuck in jail, they don't care if they're pleading guilty to a misdemeanor or felony. They just want out of jail as soon as possible. They're going to get credit time served probably. So it seems like their best scenario. a couple things about the system that I think, really have normalized fines and fees in our justice system. Just the fact that everyone thinks it's normal to have cash bail, and everyone thinks it's normal to have an intense fine at the end of your court hearing, even if you've gone to jail and done drug treatment and all these other things. When you bring up the idea, like, what about we abolish cash bail? People are just like, oh my gosh, we can't do that. It's part of the system. It's so important. And it just blows my mind. And, also the system is so powerful. Every day, my mind is blown about how much power this system has over us. And all that power is given to judges. And judges have their own biases. Even the fact that the cash bail is normalized in their minds and they support the system, that is a bias they bring every day and impose that on these people. So, it's just too powerful of a system, and too much of that power is given to judges. And, just one example of something that was really challenging in the tribal court I worked at. So they contracted the jailing out to the county. So it was about an hour and a half away where the people were held in jail. They would have to find a friend or family member who could go to the post office. It's an extremely rural area. So you had to go to the post office to get a money order, and you had to bring that money order to the court during working hours and drop it off for you to be released. And, for these people who are just driving through and are members of other tribes, they don't have anyone who can drop off a money order from the post office at noon. So it's just wild. So that's the things I can add.
Thank you for that. And it's a really interesting point, because on the one hand, we see from the data that, the public defender, the presence of the public defender, but some of the reasons might even be like, why does the person have a public defender if they potentially had enough money to get out on bail, right? They also might have enough money to hire their own private attorney, which then can sort of help perpetuate, and they have more access to that attorney potentially than you do as a public defender if you're stuck in jail. And your incentives are different, as you noted, right? Your incentives to fight the case might be higher when you're actually out on bail than they are if you're still just sitting in jail and you can't do anything about it. So I think that's a really interesting point. And I think, and obviously the cash bail issue drives a lot of that, because, I think it is interesting that people don't understand that, for example, the federal system doesn't have a cash bail system, right? It is entirely based on, potential danger to the public, for example, but it's not based on a cash system. So I think that's a really interesting perspective. I also wanted to ask about, we've talked about sort of the most horrendous effects of the piling on of fines and fees that essentially ultimately can result in warrants and then arrest and then ultimately reincarceration and then, so down this pipeline. But there's also other collateral consequences to having a cascading amount of fines and fees, including, restrictions on your ability to vote, your restrictions on your ability to receive an expungement of your conviction. And I wondered if somebody might want to talk about that a little bit. I maybe thought we're Professor Harris.
Sure. I mean, there are a host, outside of the legal consequences of, being under surveillance and the reincarceration, the added amounts of debt, then there's the economic bucket of consequences for individuals and making choices between having to buy medication or what they can buy for their kids. There's effects on education and having debt and poor credit now and not being able to access educational loans for particular types of offenses, but also just not being able to afford to go back to school if someone wants to go back to school. There's just, this is what I really, argue in sociology, that there's monetary sanctions really matter for all of the types of inequalities that we study. I pick up on a theme that Erin, addressed early on is a theme of trauma as well. I've been developing a paper with a colleague. I have several colleagues also funded by Arnold Ventures for an 8-state study. And so for the past 5 years, we've done over 950 interviews with both decision makers within the criminal legal system and also people who owe debt, and then court observations, state automated data for statistical analysis. But one of the strong themes is really about the effects on people's health in terms of stress and anxiety and depression and trauma, that outside of all of the other structural things, this holds people to what we sort of argue as an internal social control. That, you know, when I was just looking at these interviews yesterday, one man was describing how he makes choices about food, and if he has something to eat, maybe he'll save half of it for lunch and half of it for dinner because he knows he needs to make his monthly LFO payment, otherwise he's going to go to jail. Or, you know, several people mentioned driving on a suspended license. People like doing that calculation, like, I got to get my child to childcare so I can get to work. Should I risk it? Or, you know, to a doctor's appointment. So it's just also the way that this internal social control of the state, people carry it with them constantly. It's just a horrible, you know, I say this sometimes, if I was Dr. Evil and tasked with creating the ultimate system of social stratification, this is it, right? Tagging people with felonies or even misdemeanors and then saddling them with debt after incarceration, right? This is just a horrible, horrible system.
Thank you. Yeah. Erin, would you like to weigh in on that?
Sure. I mean, I can think of several examples of collateral consequences, even in what just Professor Harris just shared. Made me think of even more examples. You know, even if you get a fine, for example, here in Michigan, if it's a civil infraction, you're not entitled to representation. So a lot of the times that fine is assessed, and then you have an ample amount of time to pay it. Well, if you don't pay within that amount of time and you don't contact the court, you get show cause. Now, when the average person gets a notice for a show cause, they don't even know what show cause means. That language is so obscure. What it's essentially for is for you to come in and show cause as to why you have not paid. What is the reason? Are you strapped for money? Do you have other warrants? Do you have other things going on? But because people don't show up, what was a civil offense literally becomes almost, or has criminal ramifications, essentially, because a contempt warrant is then issued. And so that warrant in and of itself limits a ton of different things. I've mentioned jobs. Of course, you can't pass a background check, things like that. But even down to, I had a client who wanted to volunteer at their child's school, and they couldn't pass a background check to even volunteer as like parent of the week. You know, there are ramifications that we don't even consider in terms of like how even just a civil offense can, you know, perfectly limit someone. It's really class separation. That's the best way I can describe it. It's class separation, and it makes it so that there cannot be class mobility. You cannot achieve past a certain point because of this debt that you already have. Another really quick example that I'll share is in Michigan in particular, they suspend a person's ability to even pursue obtaining a valid license. So what I mean by that is, in Detroit public schools, there's no driver's education offered for free. It used to be, but not anymore. And so as a result, you can't even, you know, take your road test or get your hours or do a lot of that stuff until you turn 18, where those courses are not required. And so what happens is sometimes you have a 16, 17-year-old who's still in high school, and they're driving their parents to work, or they're driving themselves to, you know, after school activities, if maybe they live in a single parent household, or, you know, there are lots of different scenarios, driving themselves to work. And they get pulled over, and essentially they get a citation for failing to have a valid license, as in a license never obtained. And so what ends up happening is that suspension, it literally suspends their ability to even go to Secretary of State later and pursue a valid license. It's like a preemptive suspension. So you have things like that where I'm meeting 27, 28-year-olds who are like, oh yeah, I've never had a license. They're like, oh yeah, I got pulled over when I was 16 and it got out of control from there. So, I mean, it literally starts so small and can lead to all of these other situations. So.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really great point. It's like even at, you know, such a young age, and it can essentially affect you so many years down the road and in so many different ways. And as Professor Harris mentioned, right, the emotional, just sort of carrying trauma and just the calculations that people are constantly making every single day about, am I going to take this risk because I know that this is a potential consequence, but does the benefit that what I need to achieve here to go to work, to take my child to school, to do these things outweigh me just taking that risk? And oftentimes then it still results in sort of another set of cascading effects. Dr. O'Neill, would you like to talk anything about this in your research?
Sure. I think I'll just echo what the other panelists have said and tie it together with the broader spectrum of the fines and fees and costs that individuals in the civil and criminal justice systems are experiencing, and how I think of this philosophically as if an individual is charged a fine as a punishment, if that reduces their likelihood and propensity to commit a subsequent act, criminal act or civil infraction, then the fine has operated effectively from a philosophical standpoint as to what a fine does or is supposed to do. However, when we see someone coming out of incarceration who has a felony amount of child support arrears, so going back to Erin's example of $90,000, I see this in one of my projects here in Michigan. We were piloting using technology to resolve warrants online from opioid treatment centers. And so we had individuals who had outstanding warrants and who were afraid to go into court because they knew that they owed the government over $20,000 in fines and fees and arrears. And so they were terrified because they had been sober for so many months and they knew that jail would trigger them. If they were taken back to jail, that could be sobriety threatening, and that could be potentially for them death, because overdose rates go way up after incarceration. And so what we were able to do is to come together with the local child support unit and speak to them about what we were trying to do and say, look, like, we can bring these people to you. We can bring these individuals who owe you thousands and thousands of dollars, who have arrest warrants, felony arrest warrants for owing these monies. And would you work with them to put them on a payment plan? Because I have so-and-so, I'm going to call him Mike, which is a pseudonym. So he had a successful painting business. He had been sober for 2 years and he owed over $20,000 in child support arrears. He had been on the run for 2 decades. Okay, so he did everything under the table. So pushed into the underground economy. Everyone he paid, it was all cash, cash, cash. He didn't have a driver's license, even though he owned a truck for his job. And so like every day he had to be like looking over his shoulder. Am I going to get pulled over today? Am I going to get pulled over? Am I going to go back to jail and lose my sobriety because of these monies that I owe that I cannot pay? And so he sat down at the treatment center and used our online court system with a support person from the treatment center who walked him through it. And he was terrified that the sheriff was going to come and get him. He was sweating. He had to walk outside and take a break and come back to it. And they were able to negotiate a warrant resolution. They dropped his warrant. They got him on a payment plan. He started for the first time in 20 years paying back money that he owed the government in a reasonable manner that he was able to sustain. And now he can get a license, he can pay taxes, he can get back into the system. And so my concern is that this system is so institutionally broken that it's, instead of reducing crimes by implementing fines and fees and costs, it's increasing people's use of the underground economy and going beneath the radar of just not following the law per se by not having a legit license. And then, you know, your car can't be registered if you don't have a license. So we're talking about just like infraction, crime adding up because he owed so much money from the time he was using drugs. So I think that's all I'll say on that point, but you can see how these fines and fees can really spiral and push someone into this kind of like lawlessness, even if it's just civil infractions that can be very debilitating to someone like that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And that's a really great point in the sense that, you know, when we talk about the theories of sort of punishment, right, we talk about, retribution, and we talk about deterrence, deterring people from committing further crimes, and we talk about sort of rehabilitation. And, you know, we're obviously talking about fines and fees that are not trying to sort of restore. They're not restoring a victim, for example, like restitution might be. But we're literally talking about fines that are designed to just punish or potentially deter, and fees that are potentially going to sort of line the pocket of the court and whoever else might be profiting from that. But you're not getting the deterrent effect from that, because all you're doing is essentially causing people to make calculations about other potential things that they might need to, do that might essentially still be a violation of the law in order to continue to survive as a human being in this world. Thank you for that. Michael, do you have anything you'd like to add to this, or how this sort of affects separately Native American communities?
Yeah, I think it's similar. You know, the collateral consequences if you're arrested and you're poor, are just cascading. They're extreme. So I all the time would be with my clients in court they would be accepting a plea agreement that included fines that I knew they had no way of paying. So they're accepting the plea agreement, they're in a good mood because they're getting out. I know that they're going to be back. They're going to be violating their probation when they can't pay that fine. Like Erin was talking about, they're going to get an order to show cause with the court date. They're not going to show up because they still can't pay the fine. The judge is going to issue an arrest warrant, and then they're terrified of the arrest warrant. And so they're just on the run. They'll flee the reservation. Some guys I never saw again. I don't know where they went. And it's all from a tiny little crime and the fine that came with that. So yeah, the collateral consequences of this stuff can't be overstated. If we're talking about bail, if you're arrested and you can pay your bail, you're out the next day. Sure, you're going to have a lot of consequences, but at least you're back in your life. If you're arrested and you can't pay your bail and you're a single mom, the tribe's going to take your children. You're definitely going to lose your job if you have a job, and you're going to be stuck in there until the prosecutor, gives me a plea agreement or something. And so it's just the collateral consequences, like I was saying, they're extreme and they're really tragic.
Thank you. I'm not sure if any of you have done specific work on this, but I was wondering, just in the very small amount of time we have left, if there's any of you who can speak to the effects of these fines and fees on members of the Latinx community who happen to be immigrants or who are looking to apply for legal status or receive legal status, and how that might affect them.
The only thing that I've looked into, I haven't done specific research on this, but is just try to find literature on folks when they're brought into immigration court. And again, the financial barriers to getting released, oftentimes they have to post a large amount of money to be released. You have to hire usually a private attorney, and then these ankle bracelet monitors. So the private companies that come in really quickly, there's some web pages you can look at, and I can't remember what they're called right now, but if you email me, I'll send you the site. The monthly payments that people have to make, and oftentimes you're not going to get a date or a hearing for a year or two, so you're paying these regularly high monthly fees for the ankle bracelet to be monitored. So the large costs, if you can at least post to get out initially.
I'd also add quickly, if you're pulled over and you're undocumented, what often ends up happening is if you're lucky enough to get off with just a citation, kind of like what Michael was sharing, you're in the wind because you're not going to go to court and risk ICE, showing up or having your actual address or any of those consequences when you're already plagued in fear, just living at home, living in your community. You're not going to go into an area where law enforcement is going to be present who might hear that you don't speak English as your first language and might raise a red flag. So I definitely think in Metro Detroit, where we have a lot of Latinx people, we have a lot of Arab Americans, we have, a bunch of different kind of pockets of different ethnicities. I've seen that a lot with people just having fear around even going in on a citation or even contesting something like if you get civil infraction, sometimes if you get a repair within a designated amount of time and you go to your police station and show that you've gotten the repair, the ticket gets thrown out. But a person who's undocumented who already is in fear is not going to go to their police station to show proof that they got their, ticket fixed or their light fixed or whatever. So.
Thank you. Thank all of our panelists. We are currently out of time, but I really want to thank all of our panelists, Professor Harris and Erin Keith and Dr. Meghan O'Neill and Michael Dougherty for being here today. I really appreciate it. This has been really enlightening and troubling, but I'm hoping that with all of the work that you have all been doing and continue to do, that we can continue to push forward strategies to starting to eliminate fines and fees that are disparately impacting communities of color. So everyone, thank you very much.